Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter. I lead the Institute's work on better policy making. One of the early Institute forays into better policy making was a piece of work that was actually commissioned by the Cabinet Office under the last government on mind space, on behavioural economics and how that could be applied to policy. Since then, we've actually spun out all our institutional resource on behavioural economics into government, into the Behavioural Insights team, soon to be spun out from government into a public sector mutual. They are looking for business partners if any of you are interested. But we have maintained a sort of ongoing interest in the area, and that's why we were absolutely delighted when through Mike Horsworth, one of the authors of Mindspace, we heard that Dan Ariely, one of the undoubted stars of the behavioural economics community, was going to be in the UK. And very fortunately, Bob Kerslick then cancelled a seminar he was going to have here. So if you thought maybe you were not on our first guest list because you only got the invitation last Tuesday, it's because we only sent out the invitations last Tuesday. So we're absolutely delighted that so many of you have come. Before I hand over to our chair for today, who's Evan Davis, known to most of you as a presenter of the Today programme, of course a respectable, well, semi-respectable economist in his own right, ex-BBC economics editor, of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and Dan Ariely himself. I just wanted to mention two future events. This is part of a series we call Big Thinkers. Some of you may have been here in March when we had Cass Sunstein along. Our next one is we're going to have the guru of pre-distribution, Jacob Hacker. He is coming here on the 12th of June, and that's being done in partnership with the BBC Analysis programme. So that means we don't get Evan, we get Ed Sturton, who's going to be interviewing him, and that's going to be on the radio, but don't wait to listen to it on the radio, come along to IFG. The other thing, the invitation will be going out very shortly, is on the 17th of June, we are going to have Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Hardy, who've written a book which takes a more sceptical look at randomised control trials as a useful device for policymakers. They're going to be here on lunchtime on the 17th of June, so if you want to come to that, make sure we've got your name and address, and make sure you sign up when the invitation comes out. So that's all you're going to get from me. Hopefully you've had some lunch or whatever, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Evan and Dan.
Jill, thank you very much. Actually, I was only told about this last Tuesday, and I thought I was the second choice as chairperson. So I'm glad to hear that you've only been invited recently too. Most of you will probably know of Dan through his several books in the behavioural economics field. The one he's actually really peddling at the moment is The Truth About Dishonesty. But predictably irrational was the first I read. Was that the first one actually done? Yeah, and then there was The Upside of Irrationality too. Dan is a professor of behavioural economics at Duke University and a founding member of the Centre for Advanced Hindsight, which is a great name for a centre. Now, during the MP's expenses scandal in this country, I had one good idea for the Today programme, which was I said, let's phone Dan Ariely and see what his take on the MP's expenses scandal is, because whatever it is, it will be interesting. And this was actually before you'd written the book about dishonesty, or you're probably in the process. And Dan came onto our programme. He probably doesn't know. He probably didn't know he did. He was, he just does these interviews and doesn't know where they go. And he explained. He said, well, basically, you in the United Kingdom have put your legislators through an enormously complicated and interesting experiment, and you've discovered that they are a normally distributed sample of human beings. And actually, I think it was the most interesting thing anybody said during the whole expenses scandal. We had some angels, we had some rogues, and we had a lot of people in the middle who just fiddled the system a bit because the system invited them to do that. What we're proposing to do is to chat a bit up here and then take questions from you and then perhaps chat a bit more. If there's any sort of burning clarification or anything during our little chat here, do put your hand up. Let's keep it quite informal. And what I really want to do is focus on the dishonesty stuff, and then maybe we move a little bit beyond that into the kind of bigger relevance of behavioural economics and the policy relevance of it. But let's get the basic message of this dishonesty book, Dan. And in a way, what you said about the MPs is right. We do have people who are rogues at one end, and we do have angels. But what your book primarily focuses on is most of us who lie somewhere between the two. So just give us the kind of the account of the book on that.
So the basic idea is that we have these two views of ourselves. We want to be able to look in the mirror and feel that we're good, honest, wonderful people. And then we have a selfish desire to gain from this honesty. And you could say you can't do both. You're either honest or you're dishonest. You can't do both. Well, you can. thanks to our flexible cognitive skill, as long as we cheat just a little bit, we can keep on thinking of ourselves as good people. And if you think about this, it's all about rationalization. It's all about what kind of stories you could tell yourself that gets you to both be dishonest, but also keep on thinking of yourself as a good person. So now think about rationalization. And if rationalization is the issue, the kind of things that make rationalization easier would get people to misbehave more and still think of themselves as good people. So again, if you think about the MP, if you have other MP friends who are, paying for moths or for, all kinds of other things, what is your sense of what's acceptable? And the idea is that sometimes we know what's legal and not, but what's really controlling our behavior is what we find acceptable and not acceptable. And this is determined by rationalization, by what other people are doing, and so on. And I'll give you kind of an extreme example if I can. So I do lots of experiments on these people, but I also interviewed some big cheaters. People who committed all kinds of crimes, all the way from selling sports games to doping in sport to insider trading and so on. One of the most interesting guys I talked to, when he was 12, he was brought to work for the family business. And this was a family business in which they sold VCRs and TVs and radios, but they basically had 3 rules of commerce. The first rule was to try and get the government out of their business, so no taxes, and everything was held in cash. The second rule was that every time they would advertise cheap products, but when customers came in, they would try to get them to buy more expensive stuff that was better for them. And the third rule was that every winter they would take all the merchandise they couldn't get rid of, they would put it in one corner of the warehouse, they would break the pipes above it, take a hose and wet the merchandise, and they would submit an insurance claim. Sometimes the insurance would let them keep the merchandise, in which case they would move to a new insurance company and wet the same stuff again the following year. Anyway, so this guy grows up in this environment from age 12 on, and when he becomes 18, he goes to college. And what do you think he goes to study? Accounting. I don't know where have you been. Accounting. Anyway, so he goes to study accounting. 2 years into accounting school, it's a family business. He gets the family in, and he says, we have been doing things the wrong way. This is not right. We have been skimming. We've been taking an amount of money, not paying taxes. This is no way to get rich. He said, if we really want to do things the right way, we need to have an IPO. Then we can dump lots of stock and get really wealthy. And he says, look, to get an IPO, you want to show an increase in revenue. Now, for regular companies, how do you show increase in revenues? You work harder. For the Antar family, there's another option, which is they cheat less. So for the next 4 years, they cheat by 25% less every year. They show this amazing improvement in the books, and then 4 years later, they have an amazingly successful IPO. They dump about $100 million worth of stocks. Now, up to this point in discussion with Sam, he seems like the poster boy for the Chicago School of Economics. The guy just doesn't care about anything. He doesn't care about customers, the government, and so on. But here is where the story turns out. And then eventually, a lot of them went to prison. I said, so if everything was like this, how did you all end up in prison? And he said, here's what happened. They were a very traditional hierarchical family. And he worked for his cousin Eddie. But Cousin Eddie's father was the head of this tribal family. And all of a sudden, Crazy Eddie sells $100 million worth of stocks. And guess what? His father is no longer in control. It's Crazy Eddie who now everybody comes to hear his advice and ask for him. De facto, he becomes the head of the family. And Crazy Eddie's father doesn't like this new solution. He doesn't like this new structure. He tries to rein things back unsuccessfully. So, Crazy Eddie has a wife. And his name is Debbie. And everybody behind her back calls her Debbie 1. You can see where this is going. He also has a mistress, also called Debbie. Everybody calls her Debbie 2. And Sam said she was a slicker, more modern version of Debbie 1. Anyway, on New Year Eve, Crazy Eddie's father calls Debbie 1 and gives her the address for Debbie 2's apartment. She goes to her apartment, and he said that they call it the New Year Massacre. Now, from that point on, the family just broke down. Why? When Sam describes to me like this story, he is appalled. Like, he is disgusted. He looks at me and he says, there are some things you just don't do. There are lines you don't cross, right? You don't tell a husband about you don't tell a wife about her husband's mistress. Everything else was fine. This looked like a moral violation. Now, there's lots of questions about Sam's story. By the way, and everybody thought this was a terrible moral violation. The family split. They gave information to the FBI about other parts of the family, and this was how things went down. Now, here's the thing. So first of all, there's a question of, can Sam ever develop a moral fiber if from age 12 he worked in this environment? But I started thinking, are we all a little bit like this family where we have, when you think of them, are they amoral? Don't they have any morals? No, they have morals, but not in every aspect of life. They have this whole range of things that deal with government and customers and so on, where there's no morality. They were the perfect economic rational actors. And then they had this other domain that had to do with dealing with the family. Your handshake, your word is your word. You don't tell the wife about her husband's mistress, where these things were incredibly strict and incredibly regulated by a moral code. And, I think we're all a little bit like that. So I'm not going to ask you, but when I ask my students how many of them have illegal downloaded information on their computers, they all said they do. And when I said how many of them are embarrassed by this, nobody is, right? How many of them worry about this? Or nobody is. And in some way, this is their domain in which they basically said, this is just how we do things. Now, they know it's illegal. It's in the title, illegal downloads. There's no question. But do they care? The answer is no. And I think that's what social structure does. Social structure takes a particular activity and says, don't worry about this. This is just the way things are done. And I think in government there's lots of cases like this, where maybe it's not the way things are described in the law book, or maybe it's not exactly what the original intention, but if everybody is doing it, we don't feel guilty about it, and therefore we feel really free to behave this way.
And there are a lot of implications of that. We'll explore that. It's infection. It means you can get a culture of more dishonesty or less dishonesty, and that has policy implications. And part of the implication is that you're trying to find ways, if you want to reduce dishonesty, as a lot of government is involved in trying to do, you're trying to find ways of jolting people into believing that this thing is immoral and reminding them of how immoral it is, so that little bit of moral spark flies. Yep. So let's take an example, because you've got quite a good one about the income tax form and how you would design an income tax form.
Yeah. So again, if you think about rationalization, you're saying it's not about the consequences, getting caught and so on. It's about what do you think at the moment, right? So how can you get people to think at the moment that something is not okay? Right? What would it look like? I'll tell you a little joke. So the joke is that I'll give you the Jewish version. You can play in your heads a different version. A guy goes to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, you wouldn't believe it, but somebody stole my bicycle from synagogue." And the rabbi is appalled. He said, "How? Stealing your bicycle from synagogue?" He said, "This is terrible." He said, "I'll tell you what you do. Come to synagogue next week and sit in the front row. And as we go over the 10 Commandments, turn around and look at everybody in the eyes. And when we get to thou shalt not steal, see who can look you in the eyes, you'll know that's your thief." The guy is very excited, the rabbi is excited, comes to synagogue, sits in the front row, turns around doing the 10 Commandments. After the service is over, the rabbi is anxious to know whether the advice worked or not. He waits for the guy at the door. He said, "So, did it work?" The guy said, like a charm. He says, the moment we got to thou shalt not commit adultery, I remembered where I left my bike. So where does this lead us in terms of experiment? We did some studies when we showed that when you ask people to recall the 10 commandments, even if they don't remember the 10 commandments, they stop cheating. We show that when you get self-declared atheists to swear in the Bible, they stop cheating. And this is really the idea that it's all about reminders. It's all about what do you think at the moment. Now, this is all about mindset. So imagine you're going to fill your expense reports or some tax form. There's a question of what you think is just in the general sense, but there's also a question of what do you think right now? What is occupying your mind? And can we get you to consider morality in a slightly higher way at that moment? So we did all kinds of experiments, the 10 Commandments, the Honor Code, and so on. One of the nicest ones was with an insurance company. This was an insurance company that sends people a form asking them to declare how many miles is there on their odometer reading. Now, if you have a higher mileage reading, your insurance would go up because it means you drove more. If you have a lower, it would get lower. And they gave us 20,000 forms, and the only thing we changed was the line on the signature. Some people wrote the odometer reading and then signed, and some people signed first and then the odometer reading. And the people who signed first reported to be driving 2,400 miles more on average. Now, we didn't actually check the odometer, so we don't know if they cheated or didn't cheat, but they cheat by 15% less, right? Which is quite good. And again, if you think about this idea, it's all about what is in people's mind right now. I'll tell you very quickly about two other experiments. Actually, I got an email today.
But sorry, just on that one. So putting the signature at the top,
First,
saying, I will tell the truth before you fill out it, is better than signing it at the bottom saying, I have told the truth.
The moment you get to the end of the
Because the moment you fill out the odometer reading, your mind is thinking.
Right. So if you start by saying honesty is crucial here, honesty is likely to follow, at the end of things, you basically you've cheated already, it's too late. You know, and it's kind of interesting if you think about court. In court, everybody swears on the Bible before. I don't know if they still swear on the Bible here? Yeah. But people swear on the Bible before, right? Nobody would think that we should do it at the end. You know, finish your testimony. And I think, you know, and it's kind of interesting that I think in the oral tradition, we all have this intuition that you want to first think about honesty and then do the testimony. But somehow in the written tradition, I think lawyers, I'm sure there are lawyers here and there, lawyers are basically kind of, with the notion of certification, lost this understanding of this initial aspect of how do we get people to think about honesty. And we need to really get back to that.
I mean, the subtitle of the book is, what is it, how we're dishonest, especially to ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah. And there is a chapter on self-deception. And now, I've tended to think of self-deception as being the worst kind of deception in a way, and the politicians who deceive themselves, it's the most annoying of all of. I mean, you can sort of tell they're lying sometimes, but if they're just sort of stupid and deceive themselves, it's annoying. Then we had a book actually by a chap called Ian Leslie, I don't know, which was actually the kind of the defense of self-deception, which is very much your account, which is self-deception is something we're blessed with, which makes lying to everybody else much easier and more authentic. But just give us a little more flesh on the self-deception account.
So the basic way to think about the benefit of self-deception is to think about poker. If you play with somebody else, you don't want to give out your cards. If you want to pretend something, it's good not to doubt. If you're going to lie, you don't want to give away those things. So the evolutionary idea is that self-deception is a very useful thing, because if we do lie, it helps us live with this in a very in a sensible way, not to keep on doubting ourselves and not to give it away. And I actually think that there are two types of self-deception. I think there's the self-deception in which you convince yourself so deeply that you've done the right thing that under no condition can you ever figure out that this was not correct. And then there's the other type of self-deception that you can go back and say to yourself, I should have known all along. It's the self-deception that you get not to think about yourself as being bad, but if you reflect on it, you can actually understand that this was a bad thing. And I think the second one is much more common. The kind of the pure self-deception, which you have no idea, is much more tricky. There's another interesting thing. So in our experiments, one of the things we test self-deception and so on, but one of the things we were inspired by is all the people who lie on their resumes. So I don't know if you remember, but there were some scandals recently about all kinds of CEOs who had degrees on their resume that didn't exist. And I used to teach at MIT in Boston, and the head of admissions at MIT had 2 degrees on her resume that they never, she never went. And, you know, at some point somebody discovered it. She was the dean of admission, by the way, for 25 years. And she wrote a very successful book about how to be true to yourself when you apply to college. So we asked the questions about resume. So imagine what happens if you add something not perfectly correct to your resume, but now you have a reminder about that. So what we did was we did a regular experiment on dishonesty, but some people got a certificate to acknowledge their faked performance. So imagine you in the experiment, all of you got a chance to lie, all of you didn't get a chance to lie, all of you exaggerated your performance, you got paid more, but I also gave you a certificate. Some of you, I gave you a certificate to acknowledge your fake performance. And then we asked you to hang this certificate on the wall in your room and to come back a week later. What happens to the people who hang their fake certificate to the people who don't? The people hang out the fake certificate, start believing it to a higher degree. And I think there's lots of time in which people start telling lies, and then they kind of come to kind of have traces in reality. They're on your resume, they're on the website, and so on, and then people start believing them to a higher and higher degree. Lots of people, for example, make up. In the US, I think that the last 10 people who declared that they were the last survivor of First World War were all too young to be in that war. You know, people start telling stories, and then once they get some acknowledgement, start believing it to a higher degree.
No, well, and memory does that, because the mind constructs narratives that help you process information. Let's go through some. We've sort of got the gist of the theory. Let's go through some applications. I want to start on one which is slightly off. It's not in the book, which in a way is a bit about a sort of the conduct of politics. I think maybe more true of this country than your country, but it's a conduct of politics in which we catch people out or catch them doing something incompetent or minorly scandalous. And then there's a clamour for a resignation as a result of that. And say 60% of the time they're actually forced to resign. It just becomes untenable, and the clamour becomes too loud for them to get on with their job. And I slightly worry that we've got into the habit of, you end up with the people who are in all the jobs are not the best people or the most moral people or the most competent people. They're the ones whose peccadillos haven't yet been uncovered. And I just wonder how we should sort of get out of that, because it seems very harsh to the public to say when people have done something bad, we say, most people do bad things, so let's let you off. But if, for example, we discovered that a minister had lied and exaggerated a claim on an insurance policy, that would probably be terminal for their job. And yet, your book will tell us that most people might do that. And if you sack the minister for doing that, then you're going to replace them with another minister who does that. You do have it in the States. You sack people who, I think you didn't pick people who, for Attorney General, who paid their nannies or paid their cleaners in cash and didn't check on their immigration status.
We also had some issue with a public official who had a blowjob in office. No, there's a lot of it. Actually, if you look at the people who get confirmed to have all kinds of political affiliation, the percentage of people who are not confirmed because of tax issues is incredible. The American tax code is incomprehensible. Nobody could do it the right way. It creates lots of job for accountants. But there's really almost no way to do your taxes right. If anybody would go,
That what you tell yourself?
Yeah. Yes. I had an interesting thing, because they told me I did something wrong, and I was very upset about this. And it turns out the tax people were wrong. Like, it's just, you have thousands of pages of documents, and you have to have experts in all kinds of nuances. It's a terrible system. I'm sure yours is much better. But the amount of people who get to be confirmed and cannot because somebody discovers something about their taxes, I think it's about a third of the people. So there is this problem. But here is the big issue. So let's assume that we all have a capacity to be dishonest. Right? We all have the capacity to socially to be dishonest, sometimes professionally, sometimes in our personal lives. And it's not the marking of a bad individual, it's just the marking of an individual. Now the question is, how do we accept it, but at the same time not increase that? So if we show lots of forgiveness, if every time people behave badly, we said, oh, you're just a human being, what do we expect? Then the social understanding of what the boundaries are gets to deteriorate in a
and then people push it a bit further, you kind of get an inflation of the...
So I think that's kind of the conundrum. The conundrum is, how do we acknowledge that people are people, but how do we not deteriorate the moral compass? I mean, personally, I think that somebody who's committed a big crime, and all the big criminals I've talked to, I think now are much more honest than they used to be. I think they actually think about it daily. So my suspicion is that somebody who was caught in a big way get to reframe how they think about misbehavior. So maybe it should be a qualification of your MPs to be caught once, and then you get to think about. By the way, this is a very different direction, but I think, for example, that it's good for people to get divorced once. I think once you see a relationship fail in a kind of magnificent way, you actually get to think differently about relationship. So, and I think the same thing is about honesty, right? We don't really have this very good standard of how to behave and what's acceptable and not acceptable. When you fail in a miserable way and you get to re-understand again the rules, so I think it's useful.
But what we need is some sort of moral censure that doesn't necessarily mean we punish you to the degree that you are completely outcast compared to
so you want something that says this is inappropriate, this is not something we tolerate, but at the same time we understand that you're human and therefore you might actually be more useful for us moving forward. But so what kind of punishment could you do, right? I think actually some kind of resigning from their job doesn't seem to me like that's the right one. Maybe some you have like civic. Do people here? I know that people don't do national service or something.
No, they don't. I mean, we have community service.
I think you could do all kinds of things that would actually send a message about the inappropriateness, but not take a generally good politician who has been human and take them out.
Feels we should invent some sort of cultural thing that it sort of condemns but doesn't force them out of office necessarily.
The other thing, by the way, that I really feel strongly about is confessions. So we've done some experiments in which we give people lots and lots of chances to be dishonest over time, and we see basically an increase in dishonesty over time. And one of the things we see is this pattern we call the what the hell effect, where people for a long time are kind of slightly dishonest, and then at some point they switch and start cheating all the time. And the way we think about it is that we think of ourselves in categorical terms. We're either honest or dishonest. Now you could be 92% honest and think of yourself as honest, but if you're 72% honest, is it worthwhile to do something to move to 82? Right? There's no point. You're in the dishonest category. This is, by the way, what lots of people report about dieting. Right? You start the morning, you're on a diet, and then you eat a muffin, and you say, I'm not a dieter. I might as well enjoy it.
I might as well be killed for the sheep as a lamb.
So we thought about the Catholic confession as a way to think about this. Anybody here Catholic, by the way? Few? Okay. So this is no offense to the Catholics here, but we went to talk to real Catholics. We went to Italy. And we tried to get the Italian priest to explain to us the logic of confession. If you think about confession, it's a very strange mechanism. It's a mechanism where you get absolved. If you could get absolved, you would reason you would sin more. In fact, you would sin on the way to confession. By the way, the story of the Catholic confession is very interesting. It used to be that people could confess only once in their lifetime. That's why you see in the movies people trying to confess just before their deathbed. You don't want to confess too early because then you have to be good. That's kind of a game. But we did some experiments with confession, and confession does work. So people cheat a little bit, they start cheating a lot, and confession does reset people.
It puts them back down.
Puts them back to the pre-what the hell level.
Right. That's interesting.
And I think we need that. I think you can think about you can see the picture here. You can think about the Reconciliation Act in South Africa as a way to reset the moral compass of a country. Now, of course, it's a problematic country and so on. But what would it look like if we said to people? Because if somebody has a baggage of doing lots of bad things, why would they do something good tomorrow? I got this letter from a woman in Greece a few weeks ago. She's selling her house and they wanted to pay taxes. She said, "Why now? Can't we start in 6 months?"
So yeah, that's one. Let's talk about a policy issue, criminal behaviour in general. In a way, you turn up as a bit of a fan for zero tolerance, broken windows theory, because the infectious nature of crime means that at the individual level, you test the limits and perhaps extend them as time goes. And in a community, if some people are doing it, other people will do it. So just root it out from the moment you can start.
Here's the problem. So imagine that you took a time horizon and you say we have the time before a crime is committed, we have the time during a crime is committed, and then we'd have after. The standard theory of justice is all about after. It says, let's just have big punishments. And if we have big punishments, everybody will do the cost-benefit analysis and nobody would commit any crime. And there's really no evidence that anybody does the cost-benefit analysis. In the US, we have the death penalty in some states, and there's no evidence that the death penalty is reducing crime, even though it's a harsh punishment. I mean, you can't get worse than that. You can reflect on your own lives, right? When was the last time you thought about the cost-benefit analysis? Did you see the nice cutlery outside here, by the way? You could have taken some home and nobody would have noticed and there'll be no punishment. I'm guessing most of you didn't think about this, right, until now. And also in our experiments, people don't seem to respond to cost-benefit analysis. So I think that after the crime period is not the right time. What we have is that during the crime, during the opportunity, which is where reminders and thoughtfulness and so on is important. And then we have before, which is all about education. So that's one kind of basic idea to think about. How do we think about crime prevention in terms of education? And how do we think about crime prevention at the moment of temptation? The other thing to realize is even though we're talking about dishonesty, the real surprising thing is that people are way too honest. Right? Imagine all of you were trying just to maximize the cost-benefit analysis. Imagine you were just thinking, how much time will I get in prison? What's the probability of being caught? What can I gain? And you just walked around your life. There will be many, many opportunities to misbehave, opportunities you're not taking right now, right? Taking a wallet from one of your colleagues in the office who forgot it in their desk and not paying here, not paying there. But by the way, over the last 3 years, every time I go to a restaurant, I ask the waiter if there's a way to eat and escape without paying. I said, look, I'm interested in advice. If you were going to do it, what would you tell me? And sometimes they ask for my credit card, but mostly they give me fantastic advice. Wait for a big party to come, there's an alley. I mean, they give me really good advice. And then I said, how often do people actually do it? They say, almost never. Right? So here's something incredibly easy with no cost and people don't do it. It's because we're actually better than economic theory thinks. I mean, we have this tremendous sense of reciprocity and obligation and morality. I mean, we're talking about dishonesty, but let's not forget we are far from the economic rational agent. We don't cheat enough from that perspective. And that's what education does. So I think we need to think about, how do we get people to think beforehand and during. But the other thing is to think back to the story about Sam and to think back about illegal downloads and to realize that there's a possibility that you would take a particular part of how society functions and basically eliminate guilt from that. And that's where things become like corruption. So you go to countries like South Africa and a policeman stops you and you give them a small bribe and they go away, and you ask people in South Africa, how bad do you feel about paying a small bribe to a policeman? They don't feel bad at all, right? How bad would you feel if it was in the newspaper? They don't feel bad at all. It's illegal, but it's part of how things are done. And the moment you get to that situation, this is how business is normal, this is what corruption is, and this is what the goodness in us have been eliminated. And the problem is that you can have this deterioration, where a system says taxes, whatever you want to think about is just deterioration, and once you get to this situation, really hard to reverse it. I can't think of many cases.
No, there have been things like drinking and driving used to be socially acceptable, and it's not socially acceptable anymore. But it took 20 years.
It's not corruption. It's not exactly corruption.
No, it's not corruption, no.
But it is, when you think about corruption, you say, are there any examples of countries that were able to take things that were corrupt and return them? It's been very, very tough.
I think Hong Kong has done it to some extent, hasn't it? It used to be quite corrupt, and I think is. Let's talk about a sector where goodness was eliminated many years ago, the financial services sector. And your book has some quite interesting stuff to say on conflicts of interest. Now, this is a sector where, in a sense, it is riddled with conflicts of interest because there's an asymmetries of information all over the place, and they're dealing with people who know less about the subject than they're dealing with. And I thought it was quite interesting and quite pertinent to the regulation debate that your finding is transparency is just not a solution to a conflict of interest. The solution to a conflict of interest is to remove the conflict of interest.
Yeah. So from time to time I get to meet with regulators, and I had the meeting, this is a meeting with the regulators of a European country, not here. And we did a review of how they were going to regulate the banks. And we looked at it, we spent a few hours, and then I said, who are you trying to regulate? I said, if you look at the psychological profile of the people who are trying to regulate, who are they? And they basically said that these are psychopaths. Because they were trying to regulate the people who are kind of trying to find corners and trying to cheat their customers. And I said, look, all of you came from the banking industry. How many psychopaths do you know? Some of them said they know one or two, but mostly I think that bankers are generally good people with terrible conflicts of interest, and they're not unique. And kind of the thought experiment is that if I made all of you bankers 10 years ago and gave you a tremendous bonus to see reality in a different way, we would all be able to see it, right? And not only that, but it would be difficult to figure out the right thing anyway. So the gray level was so high, and everybody else believed that, and so on. So the ability of kind of wishful blindness combined with a tremendous push from a huge financial incentive is just very hard to. So you create this system. Actually, if you think about rationalization and you say, let's create rationalization in every possible way, multiple steps removed from money, done by many people, and so on, the financial system has all of them. There's not a single mechanism for rationalization that they have missed. It's all there. It's a perfect storm of rationalization. So you create this system, and you can say, what kind of people can you put in that system for a long time, not for a day or two, that would keep on being incredibly moral in the sense that they will always think about their clients' best intentions? I think it's basically humanly impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to put somebody like, the Pope or Mother Teresa or, the Dalai Lama in that position for 10 years and see what would happen to them. It's really, really hard to imagine that's the right way. And then the other thing that you mentioned, this is disclosure. So governments love sunshine policies, right? Let's just have sunshine. The problem, first of all, is that sunshine is very tough because of the asymmetry of information. It's very hard to imagine you can create enough sunshine for people to see all the details and understand everything in nuances. But the other problem is this experiment. So imagine the following experiment. I have a jar of money, and I know more or less how much money is in there. And you sit out there, so you don't know how much money is in there. And I can give you advice. I can say, hey, I think there's $22 in there. And you can take my advice or ignore it, and you get to guess how much money is in the jar, and you get paid based on your accuracy. Okay, people do this. Condition number 2, I get paid if you exaggerate. So I don't get paid based on you, I get paid based on your accuracy, but I get paid more if you're overestimating than underestimating. Now what happened? Advice goes up. People basically give advice that is selfishly good for them. But now, let's say I get a biased incentives, but I also have to declare that there's a sunshine issue. Here's the thing, but just so you know, I get paid if you exaggerate more. Now, if you got advice like this, wouldn't you discount it?
Yeah.
Of course you would, and people discount it. But what about the person giving the advice?
This is the point. Yeah.
What about the person who is giving advice knowing that the other person would discount them? Now they exaggerate more.
Yeah, that is such an important insight. And you've got tests to show
That's right.
that
So-
with that game.
So you're saying if the incentives are aligned, no problem. If I have a biased incentives, I exaggerate. If I have a biased incentive and a sunshine policy, I exaggerate by $4 more and you discount it only by 2.
So it's worse than just...
It's worse.
Yeah.
So the problem is that people don't understand the intensity of conflicts of interest. So when we discount it, we don't discount it sufficiently.
Yeah.
So sunshine policies could actually liberate people. Say, okay, I told you, now I can really go all the way.
I don't have to hold myself back. No, well, that is a really important... Look, I want to open up to the floor. I just want to ask another thing about behavioural economics more generally, because essentially the theme of the book is there's a sort of simple, rational economic model of human behaviour. Gary Becker has written all about every aspect of life and how rational people would behave, pursuing self-interest, no other worries. And you're saying, and the behavioural economists say, look, life is more complicated than that. Psychology matters, identity, self-image, emotion, the weather, all sorts of things affect our behaviour. And you have endless experiments to show the ways in which people don't conform to the economist's model. And actually, I don't know how you even get the time to do all the experiments that you quote in the book.
Coffee.
But here's the thing. Here's where I'm just very slightly skeptical, which is we don't know how in the real world, if you pursued those policies, if you pushed on those, if you like, nudge policies, how successful they would be. Let me give you an example. So we had this one on our program recently of they put big photograph of eyes over the bike shed in Newcastle University, and bike theft went down. And in fact, bike theft went up at the ones that didn't have the eyes over them, so clearly the thieves thought, not here, I'll go over to that one, because there was a big photograph of eyes. Now, we all made quite a lot of that finding and said, how interesting. But I'm worried, if those eyes stayed there for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and if the other places had eyes as well, I just wonder whether any of the tests and experiments you do with $10 to undergraduates, who are the only people you can recruit for those kinds of things, I just wonder whether any of them would stand up to the real experience of people in the long term, or whether Gary Becker, and the economists actually better describe long-term underlying behavior.
So a couple of things. So first of all, I'm willing to accept everything is an empirical question, because that's how we should deal with things. But here's a couple of things to think about. First of all, I was very happy that we had this field experiment with signing the insurance form, where people were real people in a natural way. The other thing is that you have to ask yourself, what kind of interventions would get forced from their own self? And everything that has a social element to it, right? If you can reduce the habit of cheating, is this going to actually amplify?
Right. So you can reset people a little bit using something temporary.
And over time it could work out. I don't think we know exactly which. So for example, we do some experiments on the honor code. People sign the honor code, and I'm certain that if people had to sign the same thing over and over, it would fade away.
Yeah.
Because this is about people thinking about the honor code. But if they just sign and don't think, it would go away. But it doesn't mean we have to give up. It means we can create a different intervention. For example, what if people wrote their own version of the honor code? Now it would be very hard not to think about it. right? It will be very hard for you every time to come to a test in a university and say, what do I think is an important thing to do, and let me do this. So first of all, I think that there's a really important question of which things are about attention and would happen a few times with novelty, and which things will die, and which things would actually become a habit over time. Yeah. The other thing to say is that there is the question of nudges, but I actually think that, for example, talking about the financial industry, nudges are not the right approach. I think conflicts of interest, we should just try to eliminate it.
There are some areas where the evidence is you just get rid of it.
And I think that this is also the case where I've no doubt that studying economics is wrong. If you think about conflicts of interest, we just don't see conflicts of interest working on us. You talk to anybody in the banking industry, So I had some students who could choose between being bankers and physicians. Some of them chose one, some chose the other. And I don't think they're different people, but they act so very differently. Their whole worldview is changing. You talk to these guys, they feel that they are knights in shining armor, protecting the world and escorting us to, and all the blame and so on is just wrong. We have this tremendous capacity to tell ourselves wonderful stories. So is this even at all compatible with an economic theory of rationality? I don't think so. So I think we need to be empirical. We need to think about all the areas of life, what kind of mistakes people make, what kind of mistakes people might be aware of, what kind of mistakes we could fix with nudges, what's the one that we just need to regulate out. Dishonesty and conflicts of interest, I think, is one of those cases that the economic theory, in my mind, is like there's just no evidence that it's right, and because of that, we need to do different things. Right. We need to change how we think about crime, we need to change how we think about conflicts of interest. I just don't see any other way.
And you're absolutely right. The evidence is if you can make a temporary change anyway, it can become permanent and become
in some
large.
cases, yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Well, that's the formal part of the proceedings over. But I'm sure some of you have questions. The usual rules apply. It's nice to know who you are. And there are roving microphones. I'll tell you what, we'll take Stefan in the front row and then we'll sort of move slightly back. Stefan Stern here from Edelman.
Thank you. Quick observation, quick question. I think from corruption to honesty, I think taxi drivers in Bucharest is a story I was told that 15 years ago it was a complete free-for-all and a few people decided they wanted to make it legit, and it now is, but I'm happy to be corrected.
Great example.
Worth looking at. Groupthink. Is groupthink a form of group dishonesty on occasion? If so, what does that mean for the composition of top teams of organizations and the role of advisors who may have conflicts of interest?
Yeah, so the question is what happens with advisors and basically the ability of people to recommend things that are good for the group. I think the best examples probably are people in the US who basically regulate particular medical practices. So you have a group of people who decide what are you going to do in the case of a heart attack. And what do you get? You get all cardiologists. And you have a group of 15 cardiologists, very good cardiologists, who see everything in life through the eyes of cardiology. And then they recommend lots of things to do in cardiology, regardless of what symptom you have. But here's just a personal story. At some academic conference a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I was with my PhD advisor, and we went out and we drank a little bit too much. And we get back to the hotel, and he says, you know what, I think I'm going to faint. And he faints. He faints for a few seconds, he gets up. He's in his middle 50s, and we call an ambulance. By the time he gets up, he says he's perfectly fine. He's actually a runner, and he said his cardiologist told him that because he runs too much, one of his valves is overexposed, and it could be okay, fine. By that time, the ambulance is there. Now, he tells him the story, said, I just had my cardiologist visit 2 weeks ago, everything is fine. No, there's a procedure now. They take him to hospital, and they run him through tests the whole night. Incredibly substantive, expensive tests. By the way, I was outside waiting for him, and they wouldn't let me in because I'm not family member. So I told him, look, I have this thing on my skin. I think I have a rash. So they hospitalized me too. So it was the most expensive night I got. But he was an example of somebody wrote a procedure for what happens when a man in his middle 50s is complaining about, has something. And they went through hundreds of thousands of tests, hundreds of dollars of tests through that night, of course, reconfirming
what he could have told them in the first place.
And I think this probably happens the same way in boards of directors.
Yeah.
So I've been to all kinds of board of directors meetings, and the idea that a CEO can appoint their friends to be on the same board of director and agree with them with whatever they want, I think is incredibly corrosive. I think it's just a really bad idea. So I think we need to think very carefully about how do we eliminate, how do we think about governance board where people can actually express dissenting opinion and motivated to do so.
I mean, in a way, we have a very adversarial legal system, we have an adversarial political system, we have an adversarial journalistic system relative to the state. And in a way, that's not a bad way of coping with some of those groupthink problems, because you literally have someone whose job is to just pick holes in whatever you're doing. It doesn't matter whether it's rational, justified or not. My job is just to argue with you and sort of make you feel stupid. So it's, I mean, in a way, that's actually an institutional way of dealing with it. But the remuneration consultants, the guys who advise the boards on how much they should be paid, because we're independent of the board. It's just, it's such a rip-off, isn't it? I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. And the shareholders are paying for the consultants to tell the board, pay yourself what you want.
The consultants are even worse. Because I've talked to quite a few of them. They don't understand anything about motivation. They only tell you what other companies are paying. So they just equate. But you know, what is the goal? What are you trying to do? What's your motivation? How do we do that? It's a crazy system. By the way, the fact that you have an adversarial reporting system, my first time on the British radio was, I think, Radio 4 maybe?
Yeah, probably.
I get it first thing in the morning, maybe 5 years ago, I get to this radio station and the guy sits next to me and he starts by saying, "So, you're saying people are irrational, what do you mean by that?" And you know, I just arrived at 7 in the morning. And I said, well, you know, for example, think about men who have a hard-on. And I give him some examples of how men make very different decisions when they're aroused and not aroused. I said, here's an example. And this was Humphreys? And he says, I think it was Radio 4.
Yeah, he was Radio 4.
He says, this is Radio 4. We don't talk about these things here.
God, there are a lot of people who would like to learn the lesson of how to shut him down. Maybe that's the technique. Let's take another question. We'll take the gentleman there, then we're going to go to the back over there, and then, then the lady here, and then the back there, and then we'll go to that side. Yes.
I'm not sure how I can follow that Q&A. My name is Rowan Grove. I work for the HMRC, which is the UK Tax Authority, and my team, one of our things, we're running a randomised control trial on exactly the principle you were talking about in terms of honesty declarations. We're currently thinking, and I'm doing a lot of thinking at the moment, how do we think about some of the empirical results we've got and actually some of the theory and prospect theory and others to try and take that into a digital world and decision making where fundamentally it's different than writing a signature. It's fundamentally different how we give information, how we receive, and that relationship with honesty and the truth and fraud. I wondered if you got any reflections on that, either from empirical
This is because
work.
I fill out a tax return online, so I never really sign anything, in fact.
That's a sort of jump.
Tips for the tax authorities, and then we'll just...
Yeah, so I think this is just a very general thought, but I think that replicating our attachment to a signature in an online situation is going to be very tough. However, there are other ways to feel connected to a form. For example, what would happen if you had to upload your picture onto it? Or what happened if you had to use your same Facebook login and you saw on the side all your friends? So I think there's actually lots of potential of doing things online that will basically remind you yourself, if you upload a picture of your mother, your community, and so on, that would be more useful. So I think that if we just replicated regular forms digitally, we're not going to get the same benefit, but we can think about the digital world more generally and say, what can we draw from that world to emphasize this? And I think actually it has more potential.
And it's interesting in the book, you talk about how there's a fudge factor. You can allow yourself to cheat more where it's not as direct a cheat. So I'll steal a can of Coke out of the office fridge, but I wouldn't steal money out of the office fridge. And actually the digital world does put a bit more of that fudge factor in, doesn't it?
That's
so
right.
it does allow you feels less cheaty to do it than
so the digital
writing
world
it down.
allows you to feel more distance, which is a problem. The other thing, so we started, so I don't know how it is in the UK, Americans hate paying taxes.
We love paying taxes in this country. Yeah, we're really up for it.
They just think it's just evil in some kind. And it's an interesting thing because Americans give lots of money to charity, but taxes, terribly. We did this study. We went into a public library, and we asked people, when was the last time you benefited from taxpayers' money? People couldn't remember. They couldn't. So if you think... if you think about taxes again, there's a question of how do you feel about your role in the public good, right? What would happen if you saw something that indicated who is going to benefit from your taxes?
So you could put something on the front of your form, a questionnaire or a little video or something that really ties you in. Or
maybe, I mean, if I'm just doing Facebook feed, but if you took your Facebook feed and you said, these are the kids in your Facebook feed, or these are the who are going to benefit from education, and these are the people who are going to benefit from X and Y, and basically partition the pie, the tax pie, based on who is going to benefit from your social network. From those things, I think will create a different
what I think
attachment.
One might learn or draw from what you're saying is actually it takes imagination, but the general principle is very clear. You just have to work out some clever ways.
That's right. It's the connection with taxes and the understanding of where they're going from, and basically feeling that you're not doing your civic duty when you're doing it, rather than allowing people not to think deeply about that.
Yeah. And you certainly don't want people to have the impression that everyone else is cheating, because then it's...
By the way, one last thing we tried in a small survey, we asked people to vote on where 5% of their taxes would go. So why we give people some control. You don't want people to give full control, but a little bit of control. And people felt less averse to taxes under those conditions.
Okay, Di Mackenzie-Boyle. I'm sorry, I'm from HMRC. But I'd just like to... morality is very much a topic with tax at the moment, where multinational companies are perhaps unduly manipulating rules that are there. And what do you think about the elevation of this to become a moral issue? Just throwing that out as an open question.
No, it's a very good question.
And
I mean,
I would just add that when I first came to HMRC, well, actually it was the Revenue nearly 30 years ago, we were not seen as being a moralising thing. We applied the taxes in a sort of fair and straight down the line way. It wasn't a moral thing.
You didn't pay taxes because you wanted to. You paid.
Well, it was the rule.
The rules were clear.
It was the rules, and you had to abide by the rules.
So most people are blaming the companies, the Amazons and the Googles, for not paying the tax. Some of us are blaming you for allowing them to do that. But I mean, what apply your view of honesty to aggressive tax avoidance? When does tax avoidance stop being reasonable and become aggressive?
So I think the feeling is unfairness. And the feeling is unfairness because, at least in the US, I think people feel that the tax code has been written to allow loopholes that can be taken by some companies, but not by individuals. So this is basically saying we're going to have two tax codes. We're going to have a tax code for people who work, and they're going to pay a lot, and we're going to have a tax code for big companies that can have lots of accountants and lawyers working for them, and they can do, their headquarters can be in, I guess, Ireland. Where are they?
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Among
the whole
others.
reason for Ireland to exist is is a tax shelter for the rest of. And I think this is just a feeling of unfairness, and I think people are right about this. So And actually, I think it's a big problem for Europe in general.
The problem for the whole world, though, I mean, because
course.
essentially countries are played off against each other. The companies elect to have 100 subsidiaries, each of whom are separate tax
but
payers.
the reason it's particularly a problem in Europe is that you could live and work and be professionally useful in one country, and then you could abuse another country in terms of the tax structure.
Absolutely.
So imagine that Sweden would send all the people who retire to Spain to basically be unhealthy on the Spanish healthcare system. Not sure you want that, but as a sick person, but in principle. So I think there's a feeling of companies using the tax base for lots of benefits, but they're not participating in it. And this inequality, I think, is terrible.
In a way, I would have thought your analysis would point you to saying, look, there's the law, which you have to comply with, and we'd like to have a code of conduct about how we understand the law should and would reasonably be interpreted. It doesn't have to be quite as precise as the law, because it doesn't have to be interpreted by a judge. But we expect you to fill out your taxes like this. If you're not filling out taxes like that, we're really going to point the finger at you, berate you, name and shame you. You're not going to get government contracts, and you're certainly not going to visit the Queen with picking up a knighthood. Whereas if you do comply with this kind of looser thing, which is a bit more than the law, maybe you can.
It's because we have this notion of what's acceptable, that is separate from what's legal.
Exactly. And that we don't actually, in our system, define any difference between legality and acceptability. So the poor hapless businesses obviously just say, well, we'll do what's legal and no more. So it sort of needs someone to set out acceptable.
But I do think that the rules for companies, and there's basically the tragedy of the commons in these things. So one of my friends have a hedge fund that is in the Cayman Islands, and we've talked a lot about it. And I said, look, you are using the tax base in country X where you reside and where your people work and where everybody is getting nationalized health care, and then you're in the Cayman Island. How does it work? And he says, I can't not do it, rationalization, because everybody else is doing it. Now, this is the same story as doping in sports. So I talked to cyclists, not Lance Armstrong, other, and they said, everybody's doing it. You can't not compete, right? So if you're the only cyclist, and this is what inflation, there's lots of tragedies like this. If nobody took drugs, everybody would be the same way. If one person starts taking drugs, all of a sudden you elevate, you get to the same equilibrium, everybody is relatively in the same position, but everybody is now taking drugs. And I think the same thing goes for corporate profitability. If everybody had to pay taxes, the relative benefit will be the same. If they all avoid taxes, everybody's suffering in the process. There's a fantastic book by Robert Frank. A really important book, I think. It's called The Darwin's Economy. And what Bob is trying to argue is that the standard notion of competition, Adam Smith, is competition is always going to improve things. But he said, actually, if you look at nature, competition can destroy the species. So he said, think about the elephant seals. The elephant seals are big animals, and if you're an elephant seal, you want to be the biggest. Because if you're the biggest, you get 98% of the females. Being second, it's okay, that's it, right? Now, because of that, the pressures to be the biggest are huge. But now they're so big they die at young age from heart problems and vascular problems, and they sometimes kill the females when they copulate. Now, if you're the second elephant seal, the second biggest, would you stop? Would you say, oh, this is unhealthy, let me go down? No, you would try to be the biggest. And he's arguing that that's actually a better way to think about competition over scarce resources. And he's showing, for example, in the US, one of the competitions is to get your kids into good schools. And because schools are funded by local taxes, people want to move to neighborhoods that are expensive. So he showed that people move to expensive neighborhoods that they can't afford. The prices go up, and he shows that there's result in domestic violence, stress, divorce, and bankruptcies. So our competitions to be better off than other people, or our competition can really destroy the system. And I think competition like this is, and that's why regulators are so important. I think that the goal of regulator is to eliminate bad equilibria. If you think nobody's taking drugs, everybody's taking drugs. Everybody's taking drugs, bad equilibria, let's eliminate that. The same thing goes for taxes and so on. We just need to eliminate these bad equilibria.
I want you to do the next few answers more quickly, if I'm being frankly February. We're going to take a question there, and then we're hopping over to the other side, and we'll come down this way with the gentleman there. Yeah. The back, the guy with the beard. That's it.
Hi, I'm David Smythe from the Department for Business. You've talked a lot about sort of prompts around rules, signing things before you fill them in or whatever. Has any of your research or anyone that you know of looked into the design of rules themselves? Because you were talking about how people have a tipping point of honesty. And I was thinking, if you've got a set of rules, for instance, if I'm filling in an application where you say people are often dishonest, if the application forces me to write in the precise number of sick days I've taken off over the last 10 years, which I don't know, and the precise dates I started jobs, which I don't know, does that mean that I'm more likely to lie later? Because I'm like, well, I'm already lying on this form, you're making me fill in. And similarly, with tax, it's a really complicated system. I'm meant to declare every time I use, as a freelancer, I use a pen that I declare for work. Oh, but I used it once for a non-work issue. And so, if you ask me to do stupid things, does that sort of reduce my honesty on the important things, or do we have barriers between the two in our minds?
So quick answers, no. So we haven't, I think this is very important. I would suspect that if you start filling your form in stuff you're not sure about, it would make you more tolerant later. I suspect, I don't have data for this, but I suspect this is the case. And then the other thing is, I think rules are incredibly important. Rules are actually a wonderful thing because the rules help us figure out on which side we are. Whereas if you have fuzzy guidelines, it's much more questionable. This is why smoking, relatively speaking, it's easy to stop smoking because you know if you're a smoker or not. Dieting is very tough because it's always about one more fork or one more bite. So every time we have very strict rules, it's really easy for us to figure out where we are.
But actually, life is complicated, and that very strict rules have all sorts of disadvantages. That's
right.
The great conundrum, isn't it?
Yep.
That you want, which gets us back to the tax one. What is aggressive tax avoidance and what isn't aggressive tax avoidance? And the law has strict rules, but the public's view of acceptability doesn't.
Yep.
And so it is just hard.
And we like flexibility for all kinds of reasons. So we want you to apply your reason. And the problem is that flexibility is also a door for dishonesty. So we need to understand that flexibility has this cost
So
that we don't always
it
realize.
has downsides and upsides, basically. Let's take the gentleman here. Yeah, go ahead.
Nigel Harper, HMRC, and also council
My God, the
member.
British government is just
of
so
the,
interested in this stuff,
Chartered
Dan. They
Banker
really are. You're
Institute.
really onto something here. Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
coming from the angle of the Chartered Banker Institute. We're working very hard trying to reinstate ethics and morality throughout the industry.
The banking industry.
Correct.
Good
The
luck
trouble
with that.
is, the public and the country and the politicians have begun to have accepted ego-based political will, and that obviously has resulted in chaos. One example I'd give you here, imagine the army without army officers. What would you get? You get anarchy, and that's what we've had in the industry. The leadership has failed catastrophically. There's no authority and no sanction. Now, this is where you have gone for the light touch approach, which I totally disagree with. And I think we do need authority and we do need sanction. If, for example, Gordon Brown had said to Fred the Shred at the time of the collapse of the RBS, we're going to withdraw your banking license, that would have been a very salutary lesson to everybody concerned. And I think that we need to get back to that standard.
It's too big a conversation for us to just fit into the sort of 3 minutes we've got for the question. But I think you raise an interesting point that there have, in the banking industry, apart from removing conflicts of interest, there is an issue about how many risks they are likely to run, given implicit taxpayer guarantees. And some people, I think, have felt that it would be worth having negative sanctions. So you just say, look, sometimes banks go bust, it's awful, but if you happen to be running a bank that goes bust, you will go to jail for a year, and you'll be able to tell us that it was unlucky and it wasn't your fault, but we'll just send you to jail to be absolutely sure, and you'll better.
This is I think an important question of whether bankers actually would take this into account. So if you're a banker and you take some risk and there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that some people in your bank, or maybe you too, would go to prison for a year, is that part of your calculus on a day-to-day level? And I think that in most cases of crime, it's very hard to find any evidence for that. So, you know, unless bankers are kind of completely different people who think much more about the future, but you know, bankers have the same, I just don't see that happening. I personally think that for me, the lesson from the financial crisis has been how useful banks are. I used to think that I didn't realize how important banks are for the functioning of society. Now I'm much more appreciative of banking. Because, you know, when the banking system collapsed, small businesses didn't get loans. I mean, the whole economy slowed down. I think that bankers should be, I don't think within that many of them, but I think they should be like judges. They should basically say, we understand that you don't want your judge to be paid 5% of the verdict that they pass out. I think the same thing holds for bankers. Some bankers are smart, intelligent people. They deserve to get paid well, but they're really working at the trust of society and something that is centrally to the functioning of society. I don't think we want to put them in these terrible conflicts of interest. I don't think we want to reward them very heavily in the way we do. I don't think we want to punish them in the same way that I don't want to take a judge and start paying them and say, oh, if you make a mistake, we'll put you in prison. I just don't think it's suitable with the model of how we should think about banking.
Because it's all back to the cost-benefit analysis version of the world. Okay, a last question. The gentleman here, yeah.
I'm Mohib Rahman from the Home Office.
From?
The Home Office.
Home Office.
Is there a difference between ordinary citizens and criminals in that are criminals just better at rationalizing issues than ordinary citizens are? In any ways, are we all, you know,
So
are we on a trajectory?
It's not just criminals, it's creative people are the best at
right.
self-rationalizing in the book.
That's right. So we've tested a few personality traits. We looked at whether risk attitude predicts dishonesty. It doesn't. We looked at whether intelligence does. It doesn't. Creativity is the one that does. and the reason for that is if you want to feel good and cheat a little bit, it's all about telling a story. And if you're more creative, you can tell better stories. But we just finished a study. We waited outside of the parole office in North Carolina where I live, and we tested 500 criminals who just got released. And we gave them, we moved the incentives to be $50, so it's a little bit bigger. And there are a couple of interesting minute changes from how they are dishonest compared to people who just live in downtown Durham but have never been to jail. But generally, there's no differences.
Interesting.
Now, let's go back to this discussion we had about Sam and morality. I think that we try now to get the data of what crime they committed, so we can look at it. But I think somebody who steals cars, right, for them, this is their job. Can you trust them less in another domain? I'm not so sure. I just met a very famous pickpocketer this weekend. He was here at the conference. He's a magician. I mean, he used to, I think his history is a bit more checkered. But anyway, he now performs as a pickpocketer. And he knows a lot of people who do heists, rob casinos, do all kinds of things like that. He said some of those people who would trust them with everything in their personal lives. I think it's really this incredible ability we have to partition. And you ask yourself, the people who we arrest as criminals, do you think they're psychopaths in every aspect of their lives? Or they could be incredibly trusted in some other areas? And if they are, then the question is, how did they come to believe the set of beliefs they have, which basically said, this particular activity is okay? Right? And if you thought this way, of course, the education system would be different, but also rehabilitation would be very different.
Is there anyone here not from the British government, out of interest? Right. We need to draw to a close. Daniel Kahneman, of course, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, one of the great fathers of behavioural economics. I interviewed him once, and he said, despite the fact he's analysed the way our brain works and all the kind of irrationalities, self-deceptions, shortcuts we take that lead to all sorts of strange conclusions, he said, despite having done all that work, he doesn't think he is actually a better thinker than he was before he did all that work. He thinks he's still when he's hungry, he goes to the supermarket and buys more food than he would have bought if he wasn't hungry. Has writing all this honesty stuff, has it changed you, made you more honest, less honest?
Yeah, so...
Because exaggeration, exaggeration and those kind of things, do you think more carefully about it?
So let me give you the first answer in general is any of this decision-making actually helpful? And I think that when we make quick decisions outside without having lots of time to think, you can know about decision-making in principle. Actions are not helpful. I think what this knowledge is good for is redesigning our environment, right? So you could say, let me create a system that is going to tempt me less. Let me get a system that does something. And I, because of that, have created lots of systems that basically would eliminate or reduce temptation in all kinds of areas of life, including dishonesty. And this also kind of goes to free will, right? How much free will do we have? Not so much, right? If we had cheesecake, we'll eat cheesecake. But we do have the ability to re-engineer our environment. And and that's, I think, what government is trying to do, is to re-engineer the environment that people live in. And I think we have tremendous capacity. And I spend most of my time now trying to think about all kinds of ways in which we can re-engineer the environment. So Liad and I have been talking about how do you design electronic payments. We're going to design electronic wallets. We could design ones that get people to spend lots of money and have nothing at retirement. We could design ones that will get people to think more carefully and save more. How do we design supermarkets? I mean, everything is we design, and the question is what input are we going to have for designing it? And I'm optimistic that that's where social science could be the most helpful.
It's been great. Dan, Ariely, thank you very much.
Thank you.